Good afternoon, everybody. Today's talk is how to restart the normalisation of Serbia-Kosovo relations, which is quite a challenging question when you consider how long progress on any kind of normalisation or talks of normalisation has been becalmed, I suppose one would say. Tonight, and we have two people very well versed in right across the Western Balkan area. Bancroft, who's a former diplomat and writer and who has spent extensive time in Kosovo, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And Ian was to have James Kerr-Lindsay as the other speaker, but James unfortunately last night emailed in to say he was ill, and Jessie Hronesova has very gallantly stepped up and said that she will act as discussant for this conversation. So I think nothing much has happened. Things have been stored for a long time, but just recently a few things have happened, including the election of a new prime minister in Albania. So it will be a fascinating topic to see whether our speakers think this is likely to give things a bit of a jump start. Kosovo. Oh, sorry, did I say Serbia?
You said Albania.
Albania, sorry, Kosovo. Albin Kurti of Kosovo, thank you. And yes, just before we start, there are a couple of booklets that have been laid out here. One is a report on Bosnia conference that was organised by CSOX
Serbia-Kosovo
in 2014, so it still remains, sadly in some ways, still remains quite relevant. And there are also, to take away, those little blue booklets which set out the programme for the rest of Hillary term. So do help yourself if you're interested. And now I'll ask Ian to begin.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. The last time I was here, I think, was also 2014, but to talk about Bosnia, new international thinking on Bosnia. I think that's probably another workshop that could be convened again, given where we are today. So I was supposed to be the warm-up act for James. Instead, I'm now the warm-up act for Jessie, which is even more intimidating prospect. But I'll start by trying to give a little bit of context about this so-called process of normalisation, to try and see if we can be a little bit less despondent than the tone that was suggested when referring back to this publication of 2014, which includes one of the sessions I noted titled "Getting to Yes," which might have seemed a little bit premature in some senses, I suppose. Getting to yes in terms of the Brussels Agreement. But the Brussels Agreement, of course, to give it its full title, the first agreement of principles governing the normalisation of relations. I spent almost 4 years living in the north of Kosovo. I worked for the EU, which for some of you might not be a popular thing. I was EULEX's coordinator in the north. So dealing with quite a lot of the elements of this dialogue process. And to give, I think, a fair, objective sort of summary, there was quite a lot of progress. Not because of me. There was quite a lot of progress because of the willingness of the two parties in these years. The integration of the police was consolidated. One of the points of the Brussels Agreement about the creation of a regional command team in the north. They had a very able deputy, Besim Hoti, an Albanian, who was the main voice of the police structures in the north. And you can imagine what a move it was for those police officers who'd served MUP, who'd served the Republic of Serbia, to be transitioned and to go and serve the Republic of Kosovo and to wear the insignia. I mean, this is not an insignificant thing. Civil protection. Civil protection you'll probably know from the Bridge Watchers. This group of typically young men who would mobilize, operated surveillance functions. They had containers on some of the roads. They operated surveillance cameras. Suggestions that they carried weapons. There was a very detailed agreement that dealt with the disbandment of civil protection. And this agreement was very clever. It achieved two things. One was the disbandment itself. So the 800 or so members are no longer part of the civil protection corps. And simultaneously, it integrated about 480 of those individuals into Kosovo institutions and agencies that had never previously existed in the north. So they simultaneously disbanded this structure that had been used for very sort of nefarious purposes, and integrated those personnel into different into different agencies, different institutions. Some went to work for the detention centre, some went to work for the customs system, some went to work in forestry. So simultaneously disbanding a security infrastructure and extending the writ of Prishtina's sovereignty over the north. And the trust implicit in that agreement. I'll give one anecdote. I may give many anecdotes during the course of this talk, but they're quite illustrative. One of the points of the agreement dealt with the security cameras, but there was no baseline. There wasn't a number of security cameras. There wasn't a map with the locations of those security cameras. And so one day we had a representative from Pristina, we had a senior representative of ULEX, and we had a representative of Belgrade, and we walked around with the head of civil protection, pointing at buildings where they told us that the security cameras had been removed. By the end of the day, we had consensus that this point had been fulfilled. It wasn't rigorous. As I said, there was no baseline against which to sort of tick off, to verify that this had been undertaken. But there was sufficient trust between the two parties that Pristina felt comfortable that this had been dealt with. There was a point in the agreement about the handover of weapons. Civil protection asserted that they didn't have weapons, and so this point was calmly sort of put to one side, and we moved on. And in the end, approximately 95% or so of that agreement was implemented. And you don't have civil protection present in the north today. That's not to say there aren't structures in place to mobilize, alternatives linked to organized criminal structures. But in terms of the success of that agreement, I think it demonstrated some very positive dynamics. And then we move on to the question of the prosecutors and the judges. I think about 2013, there was essentially a vacuum in the rule of law in the north. The parallel systems were told to stop operating, which meant that civil and criminal cases were no longer dealt with. ULEX dealt with some of the criminal cases, but only those of a certain magnitude. And so citizens in the residents of the north had no recourse, no legal mechanisms against which, even if you were pursuing a very simple civil matter. Eventually, judges and prosecutors were integrated. The judges they didn't take an oath to the Republic of Kosovo, but they signed a contract, and now they're integrated into the legal framework of Kosovo itself. And these are quite sizable steps forward. A lot of this stuff exists on paper. The willingness of the police to collect and analyze intelligence and to share that intelligence more broadly is still very weak. Their willingness to go and target, to do operations against certain organized criminal structures is still, that there are very, public accusations of the links of certain senior police figures with organized crime figures in the north. So there are still fundamental deficiencies. On the flip side, we also saw joint trainings between Albanian speakers and Serb speakers on things like crowd and riot control, vital for ensuring the sort of stability of the context in the north. So integration of judges and prosecutors. The two gates in the north collect customs. They all go into a development fund. Some 10 million euros has been raised, and that money has gone into different development projects. So these are all things. Civil registry offices have been opened. If you want to get your documentation, I remember a quote from the former mayor of Leposavic, who said that Serbs have to be born twice, have to get married twice, and have to die twice because of the lack of recognition of documentation. If you were married in the Serbian system, your marriage won't be recognized in the Kosovo system, and therefore, if, for instance, you wanted to take citizenship on the basis of that marriage, it wouldn't be recognized. So you'd have to go through a divorce process and then get remarried, which is a peculiar. Maybe some husbands or wives would be quite consenting to that, but it really for people living in this context, it makes life very difficult. And when you have someone coming to your office, or more commonly to UNMIK, for whom my girlfriend was working for, when she'd come home and tell the stories about pensioners who can't get access to their pensions, this is when you realize that the people who are living at the heart of this are affected by the realities of day-to-day life. And that's where you realize why these things matter. Not so much as the normalization of relations, but the normalization of people's lives in the north. And that was the real breakthrough in after 2011 and the barricades. For Kosovo citizens, it's very easy now to travel into Serbia. It's very common. If you get on, a bus from Belgrade or a bus from Pristina, you'll see people moving backwards and forwards for whatever purpose. And so there was, for many years, there was a lot of optimism. You saw how, and even when we had, the sort of political disagreements, the rhetoric, the security incidents, the accusations often that the security incidents were orchestrated to benefit one side or the other, you still had progress on the technical front. Those very banal elements of, there was, once upon a time, you had to, if you came from Serbia, you had to pay an enormous sort of insurance premium to bring your car. Things would move forward on the technical front. Those small little changes that would make life slightly easier. If you want to register your car in Serbia, you have to get your car to pass an MOT, for instance. And there were no registered MOT units in the north. And so the Pristina consented that you can use a Serbian, Republic of Serbia registered sort of car service to do your MOT. These very practical things that made life slightly better, slightly easier for people living in the north. That was until 2.5 years ago. And since then, we have had a complete standstill, even on the most banal technical aspects. There are two new gates ready to be opened between Serbia and Kosovo, one in the north and one in the east of Kosovo. I'm not quite sure where. Everything is prepared, the containers are in place, but it hasn't moved forward. So this for me has been the most, the sort of turn for the worst. I can understand the need at times to inflame, to engage in rhetoric, the political ends that are served by this. And that has happened throughout the course of my time in the north of Kosovo. But I can't understand the failure to move forward on the very banal technical points that can really improve the lives of people. And this was happening even before the tariffs were erected. Which brings me to the next point, which one of you will ask about invariably anyway, which is the question of the land swap that was posited. Now, there are various sort of forms of this land swap, whether it's the 4 northern municipalities, whether it's simply Leposavic, which became part of Kosovo slightly later, I think in the late 50s, went from Serbia and was sort of internal boundaries were shifted. I even saw last week a proposal that would include parts of eastern Kosovo where Serbs live around Gilane. And of course, South Serbia, it's not a simple case of handing over Preševo, Bujanovac, or Preševo, Bujanovac and Medveđa, because in the south of Serbia you have the highway that links with North Macedonia. You have this infamous base, humanitarian assistance base, whatever other purposes it may serve. So in the case of South Serbia, it would certainly involve the withdrawing of what would be borders. Now, the interesting thing for me is not so much why land swap is appealing to Serbia, why it's appealing to Belgrade. I think it's readily understood that if Belgrade could find what they would see as some dignified way out of the Kosovo conundrum, then they would be willing to accept it. The interesting point, I think, is why has this started to appeal to certain figures of authority in Pristina, namely Thaci and the team surrounding him. And I think that demonstrates a lot about the sort of cold-hearted or objective reflections on how Kosovo has or hasn't consolidated its status in the 12 years since declaring independence, and a realization that the next 12 years won't get any more straightforward on that front. And a realization in Pristina that if a compromise is not reached, that Serbia has fought a very effective foreign policy in terms of the de-recognition campaign, the campaign to stop or prevent membership in Interpol, the campaign to, nobody talks about UNESCO anymore. They've seen Serbia mobilize the diplomatic assets at its disposal, whatever those assets may be, whether it's a promise of some visas or a promise of some deals. They've fought an effective campaign, which of course ultimately led to Kosovo employing or deploying one of the few means it had in their eyes in terms of retaliation, which was the tariff regime. So this question for Pristina and for Thaci has become one of how can we find a way of reaching a compromise? How can we find a way out of this that would allow us to consolidate our statehood? But the quandary for Pristina, of course, is that even Belgrade can't deliver what they want, which is that infamous seat in the UN. Belgrade can agree to some compromise, a normalisation, some form of recognition, but it still won't give Pristina that clear path to UN membership. And I think those voices in Pristina have seen the geopolitical European reality shift over the past, 3 or 4 years, 4 or 5 years, and are now more sort of they've sort of woken up from the sort of rosy-eyed idea as to how consolidation of their sovereignty will actually happen. I mean, we don't need to talk much about the European perspective for not only Kosovo, but for North Macedonia, for Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, even arguably Serbia and Montenegro. You don't hear people talk, I think people are trying to obsess a little bit less now about dates of membership, because it really is, you're starting to look into the 30s as opposed to, some may cling on to this 2025 that was thrown around, but most are facing up to the sad reality that the European perspective is really sort of fading away. And within that context, the dilemma has fallen more on the side of Pristina, I would argue, as to how it can move forward, as opposed to Belgrade. And I think this is a shift of maybe a slight shift of momentum that means that Belgrade can go long periods without having to engage too much with the Kosovo issue, whereas the point from Pristina is it really affects many aspects of its statehood, of the consolidation of its statehood. And so, I think the interesting thing now is, what does Kurti do about this? He's come to power with a great sort of sense of expectation. I mean, he's a fascinating individual. He's an intellectual. He's someone he has that uncommon feature among many politicians, not just in the Western Balkans, but elsewhere, to be very sort of self-reflective. I was told that Rama referred to him as a bullshitter when they were in the Munich Security Conference. It seemed a little bit unfair, but he's come with a great deal of expectation, not just in terms of and almost when he came out on top in the polls, immediately he said Srpska Lista won't come into government, and within 4 or 5 months it became apparent to him that this was untenable, and he had to back down. So I think for Kurti now, he's going to realize the cold, hard realities of dealing with these questions. Vetvendosia has always promised that they will reunify Mitrovica, for instance. But good luck to them achieving that. It would be the one thing that would lead to the immediate withdrawal of Serbs from all the institutions that, in the past years they've been committed to integrating into. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how Kurti himself can deal with this issue. I know there are attempts ongoing to try and build some rapport between Kurti and in particular the Office of Kosovo Metohija here in Belgrade. Obviously, we always talk about windows of opportunity, and there always seems that there are very small windows. I mean, of course, we have elections in Serbia approaching. There's one eye on the presidential elections in the US, given all these latest sort of gimmicks of flights and rail, and we've already seen that the representatives who went to sign on Kosovo's behalf had no authority from the newly appointed government. So there's a lot of cynicism, a lot of skepticism as to where this American initiative is actually leading. We have, the impending indictments from the Specialist Chamber, which are going to have quite a destabilizing effect on the sort of sentiment, at least, in Kosovo. And then, of course, we have Thatcher's mandate coming to an end in 2021. So we're in a period now where there will be some reflection on the agreements made to date. And there will be, of course, also the Europeans considering how they can sort of supplement their own presence in the region with a special envoy. We'll have a period of reflection where the agreements will be reflected upon. One of my concerns is that because of this weight of expectation, attached to Kurti and his commitment to trying to combat organized crime and corruption, he's going to run up to some very embedded, particularly PDK figures within the judiciary, within the police, within the intelligence agencies. And it's going to be very, very difficult for him to actually try and sort of clamp down on the nepotism, on the corruption, on all those things that sort of have eaten away at the institutions of Kosovo over the years. As I said, his challenge will be one of managing expectations. And of course, there's always been that temptation when things are not working for, and this applies in Belgrade as equally as it does in Pristina, when things are not working for you on the domestic front, turn your attention to the to the issue of relations with the other side. And so there may be a temptation to take a harder line. There may be temptation to pass a law on trial in absentia and to prosecute a few Serbian war criminals, alleged Serbian war criminals who are out of the hands of Pristina's legal structures. And there's also a sense, and this is another critique of dialogue itself. You know, dialogue has not evolved. It's still been the same sort of. You know, someone said to me, dialogue is something that's done for the sake of dialogue. It's still the same modality. It's been, you know, these long, arduous discussions between the same people. It hasn't been supplemented by different channels. It's still very, particularly from the Belgrade side, it's still very centralized. It hasn't. There are initiatives between the chambers of commerce, for instance, but it hasn't given. I think one of the expectations, I haven't had a chance to read through this, but I think one of the expectations was that, you know, dialogue would open the door for a lot of other simultaneous relationships to exist between Serbs and Kosovars that would help supplement in different spheres, you know, the sort of work that, you know, the Regional Cooperation Council does, but on a multitude of fronts. But we still see these paradoxes where, you know, the you know, Haradinaj and you know, Vucic or Đurić would happily meet, but then the next day a sports team would be banned from entering. So for normal people, for normal organizations, engagement with the other side, if I can put it in those terms, engagement from Serbia to Kosovo and vice versa, is still frowned upon. It's still something that is not permitted. It's still something that doesn't have legitimacy. It seems like a bit of a contradiction. We politicians can go and talk openly and you know, shake hands and laugh and joke, and yet, you know, normal people who want to go and play basketball or football or have a theatre performance in Belgrade or an artistic exhibition, they're still facing pressure and intimidation. And so that element of normalisation of relations, the one that is a bit more sort of broad-based, has not flourished. And I think this is a great shame. And I think the expectation when you sat down in 2014 would be that this is something that will come out of this entire process. How long has that been? Still got time?
Oh, yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okie dokie. So that part of of what dialogue was supposed to fulfill has unfortunately fallen very short. So we've had this, you know, then we have this initiative that is quite interesting, the so-called mini Schengen, where Albania, Serbia, and North Macedonia have come together to try and, in a way, sort of replicate what sort of gave rise to the European Union, try and free up the movement of people, of capital. You know, people focus on the Schengen element, but I think the interesting point is that the mutual recognition of diplomas, of qualifications, etc. I think the key will be in the. I think this is an excellent initiative. I think firstly because it's an initiative taken without the impetus given by outsiders. It's an initiative that is grounded in trying to build those sort of economic connections between people, between businesses. But of course, it runs into sticking points. Many of which revolve around, many but not all of them revolve around the question of Kosovo and how to deal with, you know, and this is a shame that James is not here this evening because this is his topic. How do you deal with recognition without having to recognise? Where are the practical, pragmatic side of moving forward with, for instance, recognition of university diplomas without having to recognise necessarily the state as such? You know, and I think, you know, the seeds are there within this initiative. But I think there's such a tendency to attach so much cynicism to any sort of initiative that is formed nowadays. I think we found ourselves in a very sort of negative mindset about the potential for these sort of attempts to build some sort of I won't say cohesiveness, but some sort of remove all these layers of bureaucracy between these different countries. I think this has enormous scope to move forward, and in a way, Grenell's right. He's not focusing on. He says he's not focusing on politics, and he's focusing on the economic dimension. And when you see the catastrophic figures of people leaving not just Kosovo but Serbia, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, I advise you to read. There was an article in Balkan Insight a couple of days ago about doctors and nurses who are leaving for Germany. And you can imagine. I made a very bad joke the other day last night when someone made a comment about how Serbs and Albanians, the young Serbs and Albanians growing up no longer have a common language. The Albanians don't learn Serbian, and Serbs don't learn Albanian. And I said, well, they do have a common language. They're all learning German, and they're all learning German with the objective of leaving. There are private universities set up. Germany recognises Kosovo's qualifications. If you get a medical qualification in Kosovo, you can automatically go and work in Germany. And from the spring, I understand they'll make it even easier. You won't need a job. You can go look for a job and then get your work permit. So the ramifications of this are really being that they can't be. I'm not worried. I don't hear people talking about war anymore as such, except for the Serbian tabloids. But I hear people talking about leaving. There was one estimate that I was told about for Bosnia. They did some research using sort of employment statistics and tax data and a sort of variety of metrics, and estimated that the current population was about 2.6 million or so. The last census in 2011, it was about 3.8. So these things are stark. I mean, they can't be brushed under the carpet anymore. These are the ramifications of failure to make progress, particularly in the economic domain.
Even the census was wrong as well.
Yeah, the census was okay. The census may be slightly artificially high, but still, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who are leaving.
For sure.
And with the demands from labour markets in Europe, it's a dynamic that's not going to stop. So I think Grenell does have a point when he says we need to focus on the economic dimension. But of course, you can't have economics doesn't exist in isolation from these other considerations of politics and stability and the rule of law and protection of investors' rights and things like this. I think they tried this in Bosnia as well. The idea of the sort of German-British reform initiative was we'll stop talking about politics, we'll stop talking about Sejdić-Finci, we'll stop talking about constitutional reform, and we'll talk about economics. And once the economic environment improves, then everything will be rosy, and we can then resolve the difficult political questions in a slightly more favourable context. The problem is the politicians are very good at getting us back to talking about politics. There isn't an appetite to reform, and unless this is why Weidenfeld dossier is very interesting. The demographics of Kosovo are very specific. It's a very young population, and it will be fascinating to see if Kurti can really transform that economy and take advantage of that raw potential that exists. But in Serbia, when you see the state of the opposition and how fragmented and how they so lacking in vision and purpose, and it's a complete catastrophe. You don't see any there's no social movement that's rising up saying, why are people leaving our villages, our towns, our country? Because those who would have risen up have already left. And so this is also the domestic context in which we're starting to debate these issues. They're not unique to the Western Balkans. This is one of the reflections of 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall has been this sort of loss of the sort of liberal populations in Central Europe. So we have the experiences of how this plays out, but in the Balkans we have many more other unresolved legacies that haven't been dealt with. The denialism, the revisionism, it's, you know, the ICTY, of course, was never, I mean, this is Jessie's topic, in fact, maybe I leave her to reflect a little bit on dealing with these legacies of the past. But I think, you know, we're going to see, when the Specialist Chamber issues its indictments, we're going to see a lot of these old grievances and wounds come back to the surface 20 years on. And we are 20 years on from the end of the war. You know, people haven't enjoyed any dividend from the peace that does prevail. You know, in the north there are very few inter-ethnic incidents. One thing I write about in this book, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, was to try and, you know, show some of the complexity of the reality on the ground. When you talk about the north of Kosovo, you usually hear about criminality. And there is criminality, and there is organised crime, and it does have a very damaging influence. But there's also much more complexity in the way that people we talk about the main bridge and how the main bridge has been barricaded and blockaded. But 400 meters to the east, there's another bridge where people pass daily. Albanians from the south come to the north to go to the green market. The big supermarket for Serbs is in the south. They cross every day. No one makes a fuss about it. It goes on. People come to Bosniačka Mahala in the north and they trade. You can go to you can go and buy your piece of pork or lamb, or well, you probably won't get pork. You go and buy your lamb or your beef, and you'll have, you know, butcher written in 2 languages. You know, these things are going on. People are trying to live within this and that's why the community is so fascinating. I mean, it's built up this resilience. It's been through both communities, the communities that are more mixed, and the Serb community. I mean, they've been through these traumas of 98, 99, 2004, 2008, 2011, and they've built this resilience and this sort of support structure that, you know, means that families can try and have some sort of normal existence despite living in a context that is just, you know, in many senses abnormal. So I've tried to write about, you know, some of the cultural dimensions, the religious dimensions, some of the history, you know, some of the reasons for why people feel proud to be from the north of Kosovo. Some of them have more, you know, more sort of historical origins. So, as I said, it's a place that has much more complexity than is otherwise acknowledged, and it's sort of shown in many of the, you know, the Serbs in the north don't jump on the idea of land swap. It's not that they jump on the idea of integration either. You know, they really there's also a sense of complete sort of dispossession as well. They're not involved in these processes. All these agreements are negotiated without them and then imposed upon them. You know, and sold to them through, you know, fine. The one big change that happened during the time I was there was the consolidation of the Serb factions within Kosovo. You know, they now operate primarily under the Srpska Lista. And this has had, I mean, it's eliminated any plurality from the Serbian political sphere. And it's also eliminated some of the more nationalistic voices as well. There's, you know, movements like the Fatherland movement, who will absolutely not. There was a very peculiar anecdote where one of their members got beaten up, but he refused to report the story to the police because he didn't recognize the Kosovo police. That's how principled these individuals. That's how nationalistic they are. But even they have been sidelined because, in the eyes of Belgrade, they're traitors. They're not on the side of Belgrade's chosen option. So the political shift in the north has been very important. It's more cohesive. It's cohesive for not necessarily particularly wholesome reasons, but it has meant that Belgrade can exert more control through the 10 sort of Serb majority municipalities, and that's been a big transition in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think on that note, I'll hand over the floor. I think. I hope there's some good, juicy stuff for future discussion. And now I'll sit and reflect on all the things that I wanted to say.
Well, thanks so much, Ian. Jessie, why don't you?
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm not going to be long. I just want to offer a few, probably the big picture reflections on some of the detail that Ian was saying, and also offer some reflections on when we met here 6-7 years ago and how the situation has or hasn't changed in that time. So when we met here in 2013, it was right after the Brussels Agreement was signed, and back then it was a very hopeful period that things will change. Finally, we're moving through the technical discussions, and we're moving into the realm of political discussions as well. We had Marko Đurić here, which was, I mean, in this setting would be quite unprecedented currently. We had Edita Tahiri here as well in the same room. And it was quite a frank discussion. And again, it's a reflection of what happened then, and what is happening these days, because I think it would be quite difficult to organize the same sort of a meeting today. What was also interesting when I was rereading our discussion from 2013, most of the discussion was about, right, so on the technical side, what are we able to achieve? And actually some of the things that Ian mentioned regarding registries and so on have been achieved. And that was in a way slightly predicted, that on the low-hanging fruit, we're probably going to achieve a few things. We could just copy the registries, right, and then pass them over to Kosovo, for example. The political one, I think there was a lot more hope back then than there is today in terms of where are we going to move, what type of an option, I'm going to talk about the options in a little bit, we're going to achieve. And the interesting thing is that obviously Aleksandar Vučić wasn't really the person back then. It was a completely different set of individuals, not a completely different one, but it was politically, it was a slightly different scene. So that's kind of where we were 7 years ago, 6 years ago. And today, I think it's also quite timely that we're organizing this discussion now when Kosovo just celebrated 12 years of independence. We have a new government of Albin Kurti, of Vetëvendosje, as Ian was saying, in Kosovo, in Pristina, and everyone's kind of looking and waiting what's going to happen. And a lot of the things that Albin Kurti, when he was set to be the prime minister, but the government was informed, a lot of the things he was saying about, I'm not going to negotiate with Serbia, I'm not going to retract, this is principled, these are the decisions that I'm never going to make. He's actually now pragmatically taking a lot of that back. And it's quite interesting to see how someone who is, on the positive side, who is untainted in a way by the war, who doesn't have that war baggage of someone like Taci or Haradinaj in particular, that's quite a positive thing. He's quite young, he's quite dynamic. In a way, he could offer a fresh start. The question is obviously whether the political machine of how Kosovo politics is working, and especially vis-a-vis the neighbors, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, how that is going to shift his let's say, ideas versus the reality of the politics. I think the other things that has changed, and that is the crucial one for me, I suppose, not knowing North Kosovo as well as Ian does, but looking at it when comparing it, to the region and to Bosnia and so on, is the role of the European Union, obviously, and as Ian mentioned, the perspective of ever joining. And again, when we convened here, a lot of the leverage on Serbia was because of the EU accession and because of opening talks and because of making progress on closing chapters and so on. That simply does not seem to be in the picture. So now the big question is what's going to work? What's going to put on leverage? What are the carrots and sticks that we actually have? We know that the European Union is, the rhetorics remains committed, if you like, but the actions are not really there. To have someone like Josep Borrell be involved in a system like this, who comes from a country that does not even recognize Kosovo, is problematic on its own. This, in the same way, to have a Hungarian enlargement minister might be quite problematic given the liberal or democratic record of Hungary currently.
And then Lajčák is special envoy.
Let's not even talk about Lajčák. That's someone who has messed up Bosnia more than anyone, single-handedly. So we don't have the best lineup from the European Union side. And then the Americans they're going quite forcefully forward with their Western Balkan envoy and with their Kosovo-Serbia envoy that Ian mentioned as well. And it will be quite interesting what leverage they will use. And it's probably going to be quite a lot of economic pressure, and it's probably going to be a bit of a cowboy-style diplomacy. Tit for tat, or something along those lines. I don't really know. I would love to be in those meetings to see what's being promised and negotiated. But it will be quite interesting to observe how the Americans are going to approach this issue, because they seem to be quite committed, at least in the media. Now, those are the external actors. I'm not even going to get into Russia and the dynamics there, because if you look at some of the polling in terms of what the citizens want, on whom to lean on in these negotiations, it's Russia, which is quite interesting on its own. But I think what is also quite fascinating about the Serbia-Kosovo process, where it is or where it isn't, is the role of Albania and how the relationship between Albin Kurti and Edi Rama. And you mentioned that he called him a bullshitter. I think he called him even worse things previously, because he doesn't seem to have, Edi Rama doesn't seem to have quite a warm relationship with Albin Kurti and obviously Weidenfeld-Hoffmann in general. But I think it will be quite interesting to see how Albania is going to play out in this relationship, because the ideas of Great Albania have been floated around, and they've been floating around for quite some time. It's not really being discussed in public. It's a bit of a taboo, but the question is that really an option on the table ever? And I think that's a question to you, Ian. But it's also quite interesting that Weidenfeld-Hoffmann has opened an office in Tirana, I think. They're also trying to kind of, they must have some sort of a diaspora or, Kosovo population living in Albania. I don't know whether they're trying to attract them or whether it's just a general kind of political move. So I think that is an interesting dynamics as well. And you already mentioned the mini Schengen and the regional dynamics of how Kosovo is being viewed and perceived by neighbors. Unfortunately, Bosnia has become a victim, if you like, of the tariffs imposed on Serbia as well, because Bosnia doesn't, because of Republika Srpska, doesn't recognize Kosovo. So there's even that dimension that is kind of bringing the region slightly back, and countries that already have a lot of economic problems, things like that, just, they just exacerbate the economic situation. I suppose the last thing that I want to mention is, and again, as I said, I'm just going to give you the big picture, is, right, so what can we expect? What are the different options on the table? And they're unfortunately quite similar to what they were a few years back. We can just remain in this frozen conflict of whatever sort of non-recognition, no peace. It's pulling the tiger by the tail all the time with tariffs and UNESCO and Interpol and land swaps that didn't at that particular time really help the situation. That can probably last for quite a while, and unless we see a lot more political leadership both within the region as well as from outside the region. I think it's very unlikely that we would see recognition from the Serbian side and some sort of a functional relationship in the foreseeable future. We simply don't have the carrots nor the sticks to achieve that. What might happen, and again, that's where we might be looking towards what's going to be on the offer, given the really bad economic situation, both in Serbia as well as Kosovo, what the United States might offer, or IMF, or whoever. What might happen is some sort of a modus vivendi between the two countries without recognition that's going to make the life of people there easy. And as Ian said, there was a period when things were happening and continuation of that process was stalled, was stopped, retracted in some respects. And we could potentially see an amplification of that process if there really is enough of a fresh dynamics both within Kosovo as well as Serbia. The really big question that I have is, what are the carrots and the sticks we have right now on the table? And I don't think it's security, because war is quite unlikely, or conflict is quite unlikely. It's not the EU accession. Obviously, NATO's out of the picture completely. So it just really seems to be the economy. Otherwise, I can't really see what else would be there. And I think I'll probably leave it there.
Why did you take
just a couple of quick points on this whole sort of leverage debate. It doesn't function in quite the sort of predictable way that we might expect. I mean, in I think 2017, I think, the EU cancelled 7 million euros worth of funding in the north of Kosovo for a university building and a cultural centre, if I recall correctly. And I think their reasoning was that it would have elicited some. It was cancelled because ostensibly the local authorities hadn't taken the necessary steps with sort of planning permissions and things like this. And I think their presumption was that it would elicit some reaction locally, that people would say, look, you're costing us EU funding and you should be more cooperative. In the end, there was no reaction. Instead, they created this idea that, they were being treated unfairly, that other Kosovo municipalities are also fairly sort of tardy in the way that they work, so, we're being unfairly targeted. And then from the Pristina point of view, it's the whole visa liberalisation debate. The problem is, the Commission goes ahead, gives the green light, everybody presumes that means that it's a done deal, and then individual member states still need to give the thumbs up. And, this is often not clearly understood domestically, and of course manipulated domestically. Would it be easier if the EU came out and said, actually, we think you haven't fulfilled the conditions on combating organised crime? Probably. But at the moment, the sense is that because of, you even hear people accusing certain Western countries of sort of Islamophobia over this issue, or at least of being prejudiced towards Albanians, and that they're leaving, as I said before, this very young Kosovo population living in a ghetto. So again, creating this sense of victimization. And if the EU can't keep its promise on something like visa liberalisation, why should we believe that they will give a promise, on anything else? And so, from that strategic perspective, in terms of the presumptions behind what aid the EU gives. I mean, we talked about this in Serbia as well. The Russians give a loan of €1 billion. It's front page news. The EU gives regular donations, and you rarely hear a whisper. I think we talked about this about Bosnia, though.
Yeah.
I still remember one quote from the Bosnia talk 5 years ago where someone said, well, we pay for this, therefore we should remind them of this. It's not that straightforward, of course, but
I think also with the donations, it's a little bit no strings attached with the Russian and Chinese.
Yeah, there is that aspect.
Whereas with the EU, there's quite a lot of expectations around it, and it's actually harder to kind of go through all the hoops to get the funding. So I think the perception is Russians just give out, money or
without scrutinizing and without
no questions asked.
Without conditioning. Yeah. I mean, on the Trump point and the US cowboy-style diplomacy, I mean, the Serbs did celebrate Trump's election. The morning afterwards, they had posters in the north saying, I think, Serbs are supported. Because after years of democratic administrations, they felt that now they would have somebody who will be, maybe slightly more sympathetic to their point of view. I think Marco is drinking champagne in his office. And so, there has been this, I think they have had this sort of sense that maybe a deal could be done, and it can be done out of the blue, and that we can just come and, a fait accompli, and then we've resolved this. And that's why there is a great deal of interest as to whether Trump will actually get, do the unthinkable and have a second term in office. And that's going to be, as I said, that's why there are many eyes turned towards this autumn election. I mean, on the Albania point, I mean, regardless of the relationship between Rama and Kurti, I mean, again, there are the realities. There's already a deal in place for Kosovo's electricity system to be merged with the Albanian system. So on the, they've had agreements if you travel from Kosovo into Albania, you have very little sort of border control. I mean, there are things that are already happening that are feeding that sort of diluting that border between the two and fostering that integration. So it goes back to the point I was making about whether there can be some interest in Kosovo in terms of taking forward this mini Schengen idea and hammering it out and creating more of a common space. But if these tariffs are to be removed, they're probably going to be removed by introducing other forms of reciprocal sort of barriers to trade. So we'll get rid of one barrier and we'll replace it with a non-tariff barrier to trade. So it's not an easy picture on for instance, Republic of Kosovo customs stamps, for instance, instead of just saying Kosovo. I mean, so it's not we're not moving in the direction of economic integration at any great speed.
Well,
and one thing I didn't talk about, of course, of the Brussels Agreement is this infamous Zajednica, the association.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the one sticking point that I think it's if I go back for the agreement, I think it's the one thing that hasn't been fulfilled. This association of Serb majority municipalities. Fantastic EU language. I think it was full overview. To cut a long story short, it was, for some in Pristina they interpreted it as a third level of government. Sort of some will refer to it as a sort of, Republika Srpska in essence. And for some in Pristina, they say it's just purely and simply an association. If you tell that to Belgrade, they say, well, if it was purely and simply a simple association, we could have done it within the sort of legal framework of the law on local self-governance anyway. So why would we need this to be part of the Brussels Agreement? Of course, there was the Constitutional Court decision that many elements of it were unconstitutional, and we've seen absolutely no progress on this. And this was to be, dialogue has never got us to the point of talking about education and health. The schools in the north are still part of the Serbian system. The healthcare system is still part of the Serbian system. These are the two core aspects of day-to-day life for people, for their kids, for their families. And we're no closer to talking about whether those things would be integrated or how they would be managed if they were integrated. And this community was supposed to be part of this transition. That there would be transparent funding mechanisms, that there would be a way of ensuring that there's sort of curricular questions, that if Serbia wants to continue funding money into health, for instance, it would be done in a transparent way. So that community was really imperative for moving forward all these other elements of integration that are very precious to people's day-to-day lives, but we're no closer to talking about that sort of prospect. And that deals with economic development as well. I mean, that was one facet of the to get back to this topic of economics. This is completely off the table. I haven't heard the word used for many years.
The association.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it anymore.
Well, summing up a little bit, I can't. It's very hard to draw anything positive from either of your talks, which is a little bit depressing, especially when briefly perhaps certain expectations might have been raised by the election of a new prime minister in Kosovo, and I think that as you were saying actually, Ian, that for certain groups of young people there's this sort of pent-up feeling that something should happen, but then when you start to sort of pick it apart and looking for the areas where it's possible to actually move forward and make concrete progress, it then becomes very negative. One thing I was just asking myself before opening it to questions to everybody was, in the broader Balkan context at the moment, with this really whipped up over the rift between the Montenegrin Orthodox Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church. The Serbian Orthodox churches and everything around it seems to become very voluble, and there have been great popular demonstrations, particularly supporting that. Does the Orthodox Church have any? Is this sort of negativity? I know Kosovo Metohija is a sort of absolute article of fundamental belief and importance to the church, but is this particular movement likely to inject a further negative element into it in terms of Serbian, mood in Serbian elections, or which is playing more to a nationalistic side?
I mean, there's a concern in Belgrade that the legislation adopted in Montenegro is a sort of blueprint for what could be done in Kosovo in terms of transferring the ownership of land. The monasteries still, I mean, I don't have exact statistics, but even after Yugoslavia, the monasteries still own a great deal of land in Kosovo and in Montenegro. And there's a fear that there already been disputes over monastery land around Dečani, for instance, and claims to property. And we're going back into something that, and this is why I think this is why the EU is so silent on this issue, because it's so emotive. You see the people who are mobilizing in Podgorica on an almost daily basis. I mean, this really is, it goes to the heart of some of those sort of identity questions that still matter. The way that the sort of history and mythology of Kosovo is still expressed is often through the the monasteries.
Of people who describe themselves as Serbs in Montenegro who have actually come from Kosovo.
Yeah,
so that very much could be.
Exactly. And so I think, but in terms of the protection of the monasteries, I mean, there's been enormous progress on that front, and on many other fronts. How Vidovdan is celebrated in Kosovo. I mean, there are no incidents anymore. I mean, this is really, again, from a security perspective, 4 or 5 years ago there was a sort of stoning of the bus when pilgrims came. Now there's nothing. I mean, they pass peacefully every. It's only, I think, Dečani that has.
There was this one last year and a half ago, I think. And then we had the students coming from Kosovo to Novi Sad. I think there were some incidents. As
There
well.
were incidents. There were incidents.
Yeah. There are
incidents in
here
Serbia.
and
There were some incidents. The I think it was an attack on a bakery and two individuals in Novi Sad. But as I said, these really sort of the protection of the monasteries in Kosovo has. I think the Kosovo police have done a tremendous job. Obviously, Dechani still has more heightened form of that's still in the hands of international security actors. But as I said, from my experience in the north, there were very, in the last 2017, 2018, very few day-to-day inter-ethnic incidents. So in terms of the sort of human security dimension, I think there's also a lot of positive progress that shouldn't be ignored. I think.
Let me open it to questions to other people. Yeah.